On the eve of Pearl Harbor, over 85% of Americans opposed sending troops to fight overseas. The nation appeared committed to staying out of foreign wars, even as global conflict widened. Yet within a few short years, US industry would eclipse every Axis power combined, building more aircraft alone than Japan could produce in the entire war. In 2025, updated research allows us to trace how this shift from reluctant bystander to industrial giant was set in motion. That transformation began not in the Pacific, but in the political struggles of Washington in 1940. FDR's political tightrope in 1940. October 1940. Washington is consumed by politics, and Franklin Roosevelt faces a challenge no president has ever attempted, securing a third consecutive term. Behind the confident campaign appearances, he confronts an extraordinary dilemma: how to win re-election while preparing a nation that has no appetite for war. Overseas, Hitler dominates continental Europe, and London burns nightly under the Blitz. In Asia, Japan's forces grind relentlessly against China. Yet Roosevelt's voters remain focused on a single issue: keeping American sons out of foreign battlefields. Public opinion made his path narrow. Surveys that autumn showed more than 85% of Americans opposed sending troops overseas. The wounds of World War I were still fresh, and distrust of foreign entanglements ran deep in cities and farms alike. Roosevelt knew the United States could not remain uninvolved indefinitely, but acknowledging that before Election Day would be fatal to his candidacy. His critics already branded him a secret warmonger. To confirm their accusations would risk defeat. The result was a campaign built on careful restraint. Archival research and campaign records show how Roosevelt's political team avoided dramatic statements about defense buildup, choosing instead language that cast military measures as protection against danger rather than steps toward conflict. Appropriations, training programs, and tentative aid shipments were framed in technical or understated terms. The goal was not deception so much as reassurance, convincing the public that no immediate sacrifices would be demanded. That strategy succeeded. Roosevelt won his third term in November 1940, cementing his role as leader through the most volatile moment of the century. Yet victory carried costs. By campaigning on promises of non-involvement, Roosevelt had tied America's pace of military buildup to electoral necessity. The nation remained lightly armed and economically uncommitted to large-scale mobilization, even as global war expanded. Within a year, events in the Pacific would expose the vulnerability created by that delay. The scale of America's underpreparedness stands out when measured against economic records. In 1940, military spending equaled barely 2% of national output. This was a fraction of what would soon be required. The United States Army ranked 17th in the world, smaller than the forces of several European states already occupied by Germany. Training programs for pilots and naval personnel were embryonic, while production for aircraft and tanks still resembled peacetime modesty rather than wartime urgency. What later looked like incompetence in Hawaii was in large part the legacy of these deliberate limits. Roosevelt faced Congress shaped by the same isolationist mood. Lawmakers reminded audiences at home of the human cost of 1918, and many voters still spoke of recession and disappointment that followed the last war. Political caution permeated debate. To secure funding for defenses, Roosevelt presented programs as a hedge, a shield to preserve peace. His words avoided any impression of seeking battle abroad. Privately, however, he followed dispatches that showed how fragile world stability had become. Reports on Japanese expansion warned that American exports of oil and steel might be fueling future threats. Briefings from Europe made clear Britain's survival was far from assured. Roosevelt saw the eventual confrontation as inevitable, but his political survival demanded that he continue to argue otherwise. The paradox defined his 1940 strategy: foresight against dictatorship held back by public promises of neutrality. One measure illustrates the contradictions of that autumn. The Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 established the first peacetime draft in American history, a monumental development for a country still claiming peace. Yet the administration promoted it quietly, couched in the language of prudence and modest preparation. Advisors warned against presenting it as preparation for overseas war. Thus, what would soon become the backbone of an armed force was introduced as little more than a safety measure. Meanwhile, isolationist groups, most famously the America First Committee, mounted a relentless public campaign. Their speakers, publications, and radio broadcasts warned that Roosevelt plotted to drag America into Europe's conflict. With such opposition, the president was forced to balance every action against the risk of backlash. His political capital was finite, and he spent it sparingly. The outcome was a nation that moved hesitantly toward readiness. After the election, Roosevelt held a mandate to govern, but the public still assumed peace was the national course. Military figures, comparing the United States to other global powers, understood how far behind it stood. The result was that December 1941 became not only a shock for its violence, but for the grim realization that America had entered the war at a standing start, with institutions and forces only beginning to scale. These contradictions were embedded in the choices of 1940. Political caution limited the pace of appropriation bills, slowed recruitment, and defined how industry was engaged. The priority was to win the election while maintaining trust. In that sense, Roosevelt's political balancing act determined much of the country's military condition when crisis struck. This collision between politics and preparedness was not solely an American story. Across the Atlantic, another wartime leader faced choices of his own, but without the luxury of delay. While Roosevelt tempered and postponed, Britain searched urgently for an arena where it could demonstrate both resolve and survival. Churchill's Mediterranean Gambit. Summer of 1940. Britain was battered and isolated, its army expelled from continental Europe, and its cities shaken nightly by German attacks. Winston Churchill, only recently installed as Prime Minister, faced a strategic and political necessity: to find a battlefield where Britain could still demonstrate strength. His answer lay in the Mediterranean, a theater where control of geography and resources carried stakes far greater than the barren landscapes suggested. The Mediterranean had always been more than a regional concern. Across its waters ran the Suez Canal, Britain's vital connection to the Middle East, India, and beyond. Every year, nearly 23 million tons of imported supplies, food, raw materials, and above all oil, flowed into Britain, much of it carried through this narrow waterway. Without Suez, the empire's arteries would be severed, and the forces defending Britain itself would face crippling shortages. Churchill understood that defending Egypt and the canal was not simply a matter of prestige, but one of survival. Italy's entry into the war in June 1940 placed this lifeline at immediate risk. Mussolini, already in possession of Libya, sought to expand his new Roman Empire eastward into Egypt and seize the canal. For him, the conquest promised glory, but for Britain, the consequences would be existential. Only modest British forces stood between Mussolini's armies and the canal, yet the stakes of losing were far greater than the battlefield alone. Churchill's decision to contest North Africa stemmed from these realities. Preserving access to fuel from the Persian Gulf and sustaining Britain's imperial networks demanded a determined stand. At the same time, he saw potential advantages in desert campaigning. Vast spaces made it possible for maneuver and tactical surprise to matter as much as manpower. Victories here were not just military events. They were arguments to allies and adversaries alike that Britain remained a serious combatant. The early clashes in this theatre confirmed the risks and opportunities. In late 1940, British forces faced opponents who outnumbered them several times over. Italian divisions held numerical superiority, but their equipment, communications, and supply networks lagged behind. British armoured formations, though small, had better training and mobility. The result was a series of unexpected victories, most notably Operation Compass, where thousands of Italian troops were captured at small cost to British forces. These successes provided Churchill with the kind of images he needed to project: columns of prisoners, enemy tanks abandoned in the sand, symbolic evidence that the fight continued. Each success carried significance that extended well beyond the desert. At home, Parliament and the public took reassurance in signs that the army was capable of taking the offensive. Abroad, the United States watched carefully, weighing whether Britain's cause was still viable. Even small triumphs could be magnified into proof of endurance, offering leverage in the arguments Churchill pressed across the Atlantic for greater support. The Mediterranean front also had consequences inside the Axis alliance. Italy's performance proved fragile, compelling Hitler to divert resources south in order to shore up his partner. German formations that might otherwise have strengthened campaigns in Northern Europe or prepared for operations against the Soviet Union instead flowed into Greece and later into North Africa. Most historians now agree that Churchill's insistence on defending this theater contributed indirectly to delays in Hitler's timetable for Operation Barbarossa. The Mediterranean was not the sole cause of that postponement, but it forced diversions and stretched supply lines at a moment when Germany sought to concentrate effort in the east. For Churchill personally, these campaigns became inseparable from his own political standing. Victories were broadcast as validation of his leadership. Failures threatened to inflame opponents who doubted Britain's prospects. The battles of the desert thus carried both strategic and domestic weight. Every report from the front became a performance measure, shaping morale not only in Britain, but also in Washington, where Roosevelt and his advisors assessed Britain's staying power. In retrospect, the Mediterranean campaigns demonstrate how wars are decided not only by troop counts, but also by the flows of oil, food, and equipment that sustain them. The tonnage delivered through the canal dictated how long the Royal Air Force could maintain patrols, how many tanks could move forward, and how strong Britain's defenses could remain at home. Churchill's gamble in Egypt and Libya was therefore more than military maneuver. It was a calculation about sustaining Britain's lifeline while sending a message of defiance. By forcing Germany and Italy to contend with a stubborn resistance in North Africa, Churchill bought time for Britain and reshaped the distribution of Axis strength. Desert victories, measured in thousands of prisoners and captured vehicles, carried an influence wholly disproportionate to their scale in the wider war. They reaffirmed to Britain's allies that the empire still fought and still mattered. Yet while Britain managed to defend its connection to oil and empire through the canal, another power faced the opposite predicament. To the east, an ambitious empire strained to keep its armies supplied, dependent on foreign oil shipments that could be cut at a single stroke. Its leaders would soon confront a resource dilemma even sharper than Churchill's gamble along the Mediterranean: Japan's resource trap. By 1941, Japan's empire had been locked in war for years, consuming vast amounts of manpower and wealth. The invasion of China, begun in 1937, had already cost the lives of roughly 1.8 million soldiers and absorbed on the order of 70% of the national economy into war preparations. What appeared as expansion masked deep exhaustion. Civilian markets shrank, families endured deprivation, and nearly every available resource was diverted into sustaining the military machine. The result was a hollow empire, territorially vast but economically brittle. At the center of this fragility stood oil. Japan possessed few natural reserves of its own and depended almost entirely on imported fuel to keep ships in the water and aircraft in the sky. Roughly 4/5 of that oil came from the United States, carried in a steady flow of tankers across the Pacific. This lifeline powered fishing boats, factory engines, and farm equipment no less than destroyers and bombers. The empire's strategic momentum thus rested on an arrangement over which Washington held decisive control. The vulnerability became explicit in July 1941, when Franklin Roosevelt froze Japanese assets and stopped exports of petroleum. He effectively placed Tokyo's war effort on a counter. Factories slowed within weeks, and forward-looking production schedules were revised downward. Every division of government that examined the figures reached the same conclusion. Unless new supplies were seized, military strength would collapse before long. Wartime planning documents revealed how concrete this danger appeared to Japan's armed forces. Estimates presented to Emperor Hirohito's advisors suggested that stockpiled reserves could support operations for only about a year on land and perhaps 18 months at sea. The Imperial Navy calculated the situation most starkly. Beyond 18 months of heavy use, fleets would lose mobility, pilots could no longer train, and air groups would enter battle with deteriorating proficiency. The clock was set, and its ticking dominated every argument within Tokyo. Some advocated caution. Civilian ministers argued that halting further advances and consolidating existing conquests in China might preserve Japan's position. Others warned that acknowledging limits risked unrest at home, where propaganda had promised national glory. Army representatives emphasized the danger of social turmoil should gains in China be surrendered. Against them, naval leadership warned that delay would paralyze the fleet. By the autumn of 1941, urgency favored those who pressed for expansion into Southeast Asia, where oil fields in the Dutch East Indies and the rubber of Malaya offered apparent salvation. Measured against actual industrial balances, Japan's predicament was stark. Its steel output had already been pushed to maximum capacity, but still produced far less than what the United States manufactured in peacetime. Aviation and shipbuilding relied on imports not only of fuel, but also of aluminium and other strategic materials. Even as factories worked at full capacity, Japanese planners knew their totals lagged hopelessly behind American industry. At best, the highly trained pilots and experienced ship crews of 1941 gave the empire a short-lived edge. Without resources to replenish fuel and machinery, those advantages would vanish. The embargo brought these contradictions to a breaking point. Every new aircraft ordered without fuel to fly it, every ship designed without oil to steam, underscored the unsustainability of the empire's position. Logistical officers warned that unless resource zones to the south were occupied, even basic training regimes would have to be curtailed. The Japanese High Command, thus, began shaping invasion timetables not around politics, but around a simple calculation of how many months of reserves remained. Within this environment, the idea of striking the United States shifted from radical to necessary in the eyes of many naval leaders. Some proposed advancing southward while avoiding direct attacks on American possessions, hoping Washington might tolerate Japanese expansion so long as its fleets remained untouched. But senior admirals argued that leaving the U.S. Pacific Fleet intact would only guarantee eventual interference. Destroying it at the outset, they contended, was the only way to buy enough time to seize the southern resource zone before reserve stockpiles were exhausted. The plan for Pearl Harbor emerged not from confidence that Japan could defeat the United States outright, but from calculations rooted in depletion. Leaders did not believe they could match American production. The objective was to hold American forces off balance long enough to secure fuel and raw materials, and then to negotiate an end to hostilities while still strong. Victory, as defined by Tokyo in late 1941, meant survival through speed, seizing what was needed in the 18 months available before oil stocks ran dry. Economic records highlight how precarious this margin was. Once embargoes halted trade, output curves bent downward. Aircraft factories revised projections in real time. Reserve estimates caused naval training to be cut, with sorties scaled back to conserve aviation fuel. These were not abstract possibilities, but present disruptions that leaders experienced month to month. Japan's decision to strike outward reflected not ambition alone, but the realization that time was already slipping away. By examining these numbers in hindsight, historians see Pearl Harbor less as a bold surprise and more as the desperate response of a nation strangled by its dependence on external supplies. Japan's economic peak was already past by 1941. The war in China had drained wealth and manpower, and with the embargo in place, no path remained but rapid conquest. December's attack was not proof of confidence, but evidence of constriction, a gamble forced by scarcity and by leaders unwilling to retreat from earlier commitments. The heavy cost of the China campaign, the near-total reliance on American oil, and a stockpile clock measured in months left Japanese leaders with little room to maneuver. Pearl Harbor was their response to this trap, an attempt to break free by force before the last reserves vanished. This perspective reframes the strike as less the opening of an ambitious empire than the last move available to an overextended one. Seen through this lens, Japan's decision illustrates how war plans are shaped not only by ideology or strategy, but by supply. Tonnage of oil, tables of reserves, and projections of aircraft fuel consumption dictated the course of policy as much as national pride. Leaders understood they faced collapse if they waited. Their only chance was to risk expansion under conditions of profound weakness. As Japanese bombers set out across the Pacific that December morning, they carried more than military orders. Their mission expressed the arithmetic of an empire that feared suffocation, an empire wagering that a sudden blow might open the path to the oil fields it required. The decision bound Japan to a conflict far larger than its leaders could sustain, and yet in their eyes, it was the only rational choice left on the table. From this convergence of urgency, scarcity, and escalation came the plan that would reshape global war. What Japan presented to its people as a campaign of liberation carried another name inside its own headquarters: the vision of a southern resource zone, a scheme meant to secure vital supplies before the empire's clock ran out. Operation Z, a gamble at global scale. Operation Z was conceived as the decisive opening strike of Japan's strategy to secure the resources it desperately needed. For planners in Tokyo, the goal was not just territorial expansion, but survival. The blueprint called for eliminating America's Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor to buy time for sweeping advances across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Within months, Japanese forces aimed to seize Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, Malaya, and a chain of islands that together, they believed, could provide a self-sufficient base of fuel, rubber, and raw materials. Japanese records described this as a campaign of liberation, but in practice, it was a logistics-driven war plan designed to replace the lifelines cut off by embargo. The territorial ambition was staggering. Japanese military staff framed their schedule as a race to conquer in less than half a year what they estimated as roughly 1/6 of the world. Maps produced in planning offices divided Southeast Asia and the Pacific archipelagos into resource corridors, each linked to sustaining the empire for the long term. The Dutch oil fields, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the ore deposits of the Philippines, and the deepwater harbors across island chains were all marked as mandatory objectives. To Japanese leaders, this was not an ideological dream. It was arithmetic. If these areas were not captured quickly, fuel reserves at home would run out, and the war machine would stall. Yet from the beginning, those same planners acknowledged how lopsided the balance of power was. Intelligence reports compiled by Japan's diplomatic and military staff consistently showed the United States could outproduce them by enormous margins. Studies circulating before Pearl Harbor described U.S. steel output as exceeding the combined total of all Axis powers. More telling still were estimates of aircraft production. While Japan would build about 55,100 military aircraft over the course of the war, analysts warned that the United States, once fully mobilized, was projected to produce nearly 192,000. The gap was not small, it was decisive. Knowing this, Japanese leaders still proceeded, telling themselves industrial power would not determine the immediate outcome if America could be shocked into hesitation at the very start. The reasoning hinged less on numbers than on psychology. Operation Z was designed not only to destroy ships, but also to cripple American will. By unleashing a total surprise attack against a symbol of U.S. strength, Japan's leadership believed Washington might recoil from the scale of the challenge. Their assumption was that a stunned United States would choose negotiation rather than mobilization, allowing Tokyo to consolidate resource-rich territories before American industry could respond. This logic was heavily influenced by cultural ideals like Bushido, which elevated morale, courage, and swift action above sheer material weight. Planners chose to believe that a bold strike could achieve what factories and shipyards could not. The timetable underscored how much depended on speed. Within the first 6 months, Japan's military was tasked with reducing Fortress Singapore, capturing Manila, sweeping through the Dutch East Indies, and securing naval dominance across waters stretching thousands of miles. Carriers would support strikes as far as Guam and Rabaul. Logistical studies, conducted much later, illustrate how tenuous these arrangements were. Convoys carrying fuel, munitions, and food had to span enormous distances, often with minimal escort. A single disruption, an effective submarine attack, a port seizure, or prolonged storm could throw the schedule into crisis. Japan was betting that momentum alone could carry them through such risks before shortages set in. Some within the Japanese Navy did not share this confidence. Minutes from pre-war staff discussions reveal officers voicing concerns that even if the early offensive succeeded, sustaining supply lines over such distances against a power like the United States was unlikely. They knew America could replace ships and crews faster than Japan could deliver spare parts. But these cautions were sidelined. The overriding belief held that any alternative, delay, limited mobilization, or retreat would guarantee collapse once fuel stores ran dry. Under these pressures, objections gave way to the prevailing narrative that morale and surprise could win what economics already threatened to forfeit. The contrast between assumption and reality is stark in hindsight. By the end of the war, American factories had produced more than 3 times as many aircraft as Japan, and commission after commission in 1941 had warned this would be the case if war extended beyond a year and a half. Yet Japan's leadership convinced itself those projections could be rendered irrelevant if Operation Z created enough of a shock. They imagined that America's democracy, perceived as fragile and divided, would struggle for unity once struck far from its home shores. Instead, the attack on Pearl Harbor produced the opposite effect, binding Congress and the public into an unshakable consensus for war. When seen through modern analysis, Operation Z reads less like a strategy and more like a calculated gamble under the strain of scarcity. Tokyo's leaders were acutely aware of their shrinking oil reserves and the irreversible losses from the China campaign. Their hope was that the destructive spectacle of a sudden blow would extend the empire's survival window long enough to occupy and fortify new supply zones. The gamble lay not in ignorance, but in denial, choosing to ignore production tables that forecast defeat in the long term in favor of faith that psychological shock could deliver victory at the start. At Pearl Harbor, that gamble was tested. Japanese planners believed their carriers carried not just aircraft, but the momentum of history on their side. They trusted that the surprise would reshape political decision-making in Washington. But when measured against US factories, shipyards, and training programs, this confidence was fatally misplaced. Once mobilized, the United States could rebuild fleets in months, replace pilots in droves, and add industrial capacity at a pace Japan could never rival. Operation Z did not change that arithmetic. It simply sped the moment when it would come crashing down. The events of December 1941 would prove that the gamble failed. Instead of hesitation, the attack produced unity. Instead of buying time, it accelerated America's entry. And instead of tilting the balance toward Japan's favor, it pulled the empire into a war where the scale of American production would dominate every battle to come. Yet to understand why the attack achieved temporary success on that day, one must examine the defenses Japan set out to destroy. The US Pacific Fleet's home at Pearl Harbor looked to many officials like an impregnable stronghold, bristling with battleships, coastal artillery, and new technology. In reality, its strength reflected thinking from an earlier era of warfare, and that contradiction shaped the events of December 7. The flawed American Fortress Hawaii. December 1941. The American base at Oahu was presented as a fortress, the the keystone of Pacific defense. Washington believed Pearl Harbor could withstand any serious naval threat. Battleships lined the harbor, their decks bristling with heavy guns. Coastal artillery ringed the approaches, ready to fire on enemy vessels that might try to run the channels. Thousands of servicemen rotated through shifts on land and sea, a manpower presence that seemed to guarantee security. On paper, no adversary could breach this stronghold without severe losses. Much of this confidence drew on lessons carried forward from the First World War. U.S. naval doctrine pictured the gravest scenario as an enemy fleet materializing over the horizon. In this vision, armored warships would hurl shells for hours, softening defenses before destroyers pressed attacks against the base. To meet such a confrontation, planners had built static positions across Oahu, coastal batteries to punish enemy capital ships, patrols to intercept surface craft, and moorings strong enough to hold the fleet in concentrated formation. Against that form of naval challenge, Hawaii was indeed formidable. By 1941, however, the battlefield had changed. Aircraft carriers had redefined what it meant to project power at sea. Air wings could strike targets from hundreds of miles away, well beyond the reach of coastal guns. Pearl's static fortress design, while sufficient against cruisers and destroyers, had little to offer against massed squadrons of torpedo planes and dive bombers. The defenses had been tailored to an old war. To eyes trained on naval tradition, the harbor looked secure. In reality, it was already outdated. Radar provided one glimpse of the future. Installed in Hawaii only months before, the sets were intended to give early warning of aircraft. At 7:02 on the morning of December 7th, operators tracked an unusually large blip approaching from the north. They reported it, but senior officers assumed the signals represented a scheduled flight of B-17 bombers inbound from the mainland. With that misidentification, the one system that might have bought extra time was dismissed. What looked like a safeguard became another missed chance. Even basic routines undermined the fortress image. Ammunition storage sites across the base were locked on that Sunday morning, as was common when sabotage was considered the greater risk than open attack. Many anti-aircraft crews were not at stations, and weapons belts were not immediately available. Operators scrambled when the alarms sounded, but in a battle measured in minutes, those delays were costly. Guns sat unmanned, planes ignited on runways, and crews struggled to retrieve ammunition from secured depots, while explosions spread across the harbor. The Navy's battleships embodied another false assurance. While their armor was imposing, moored ships became sitting targets. Torpedo bombers capitalized, gliding low and releasing weapons designed to run in shallow harbor water. Deck guns pointed outward offered no answer to attacks raining down from above. Instead of duels of naval artillery, Japanese pilots unleashed a mode of assault the defenses had never been prepared to face. What appeared to be a steel wall of protection had no answer when the attack came from the air. Aircraft stationed on Oahu suffered the same exposure. To guard against sabotage, squadrons were parked wingtip to wingtip along airfields, closely packed so that guards could keep watch. The arrangement was efficient for spotting infiltrators, but disastrous against an aerial strike. Bomb runs ignited clusters of planes in seconds, eliminating entire formations before most pilots reached their cockpits. In total, only 8 U.S. aircraft managed to get airborne during the attack. That statistic alone underscores how fortified Hawaii proved largely defenseless once the battle shifted to the sky. Personnel schedules compounded the problem. Reduced weekend staffing left key posts without full crews. Alert drills had focused on defending against vessels crossing the channel, not aircraft emerging suddenly on the horizon. Sirens blared, but command systems lagged in adapting, and communication breakdowns multiplied the confusion. The fortress had prepared for the last war's playbook: gunnery duels and surface raids. When reality demanded rapid air defense, adaptation on the spot could not catch up. Modern assessments reinforce how fragile the stronghold truly was. Later simulations examined the artillery placements, the radar installations, and the base infrastructure as they existed in December 1941. Analysts showed that coastal guns were nearly useless against nimble, low-flying aircraft. Radar detection worked, but lacked procedures for rapid confirmation and dissemination. Fuel depots and communications hubs stood uncamouflaged. Most tellingly, the geography that was supposed to shield the fleet, the enclosed harbor, actually magnified its jeopardy. Ships locked into narrow berths had almost no maneuvering room, presenting attackers with targets packed tightly together. The paradox of Pearl Harbor was clear. Its defenses embodied answers to questions that no longer mattered. Heavy battleships, concrete emplacements, and layered artillery offered strength against an enemy fleet that never came. Japanese strategists studied those assumptions and saw an opening. They would not send cruisers into the gauntlet. Instead, carriers remained far offshore while their aircraft bypassed the wall of guns entirely. The attack succeeded not by overwhelming the fortress, but by stepping around the logic that had built it. Pearl Harbor illustrates how military doctrine often trails behind innovation. The US garrison was large, the construction robust, the ships powerful, but every asset assumed an enemy would appear in patterns recognizable from earlier wars. Once technology made those assumptions obsolete, the defenses shifted from formidable to fragile almost instantly. Even substantial resources could not defend a template that no longer matched combat reality. By the time the first wave began its runs, the fortress image had already collapsed into a tangle of delays and misaligned routines. Guns lacked crews when they were needed, planes sat exposed in perfect clusters, ammunition was locked away, and radar warnings were disregarded. The base had been shaped to resist intruders creeping ashore, not coordinated squadrons diving from the sky. That mismatch guaranteed that the harbor's defenders were reacting, not responding, as the attack unfolded. What Pearl Harbor offered the United States on that morning was not a shield, but a trap. Concentrating vessels together, expecting to fight a conventional surface battle, made them vulnerable to precisely the kind of strike Japan had chosen. The gap lay not in material strength, but in doctrine. Commanders prepared for yesterday's war, and thus failed to recognize the form of combat already at hand. The significance of those assumptions would reveal itself only minutes later, once the approaching aircraft began to descend. The clash would not test the endurance of a fortress, but expose the consequences of believing in one. December 7, 1941, the numbers of shock. At 7:48 a.m. on December 7, 1941, the calm skies over Oahu filled with engines as 183 Japanese aircraft of the first wave descended on the island. Fighters swept low across airfields, strafing rows of parked planes. Dive bombers broke formation to hammer the harbor below. Torpedo planes skimmed the water, lining up against battleships moored in neat succession. The assault struck with precision against a garrison still organized around a fortress logic designed for another era. Explosions tore through the base within minutes, sending plumes of black smoke over the harbor and leaving crews scrambling in chaos. Many sailors had no warning before compartments sealed. Flames took hold, and steel bent under detonations. One ship defined the cost in a single violent instant. The USS Arizona suffered a direct hit when a bomb pierced its forward magazine. Thousands of pounds of powder ignited at once, and the blast ripped the vessel apart. Fire and debris climbed into the morning sky as the hull split open at its anchor. In seconds, 1,177 men were killed aboard, most entombed without escape. The intensity of that explosion meant more than half of the day's casualties came from one ship, anchoring the tragedy of the attack in stark numbers that would stay fixed in memory. Disaster spread far beyond one vessel. Airfield crews raced toward their planes only to find burning wrecks. Aircraft had been parked wingtip to wingtip as a precaution against sabotage, but in practice, this turned them into fuel-laden clusters. Bomb runs ignited whole groups before anyone could take flight. Of the hundreds stationed on Oahu, only a handful, later counted at 8 fighters, managed to get airborne that day. Along the water, ships bound together in moorings created concentrated targets. Torpedoes punched beneath armor designed for the open ocean. detonating in confined waters where battleships had little room to maneuver. The first wave exhausted its attack in less than an hour, followed by a tense silence until just after 9. Then 170 additional aircraft from the second Japanese wave pressed strikes on maintenance hangars, smaller ships, and base facilities. Fueling stations at Kanoa were hit and repair yards set ablaze. Civilians in nearby Honolulu watched as bombs fell, striking neighborhoods by mistake and punctuating the raid with unintended loss of life. The morning that began with clear skies ended under columns of fire across an island that now bore the marks of devastation. By the time the attackers withdrew, the toll was heavy. Reports later confirmed that 2,403 Americans were killed, including 68 civilians, with approximately 1,178 more wounded. 19 U.S. naval vessels were destroyed or damaged, including 8 battleships and 3 cruisers. Aircraft losses reached about 169 destroyed beyond repair, nearly the entirety of those stationed on the ground. What naval planners had believed was a shield in Hawaii instead became a gallery of ruptured hulls and smoldering runways in less than 2 hours. The numbers alone tell a story of staggering destruction, but the battle's meaning also came from what was left behind. Japan's strike ignored the immense above-ground fuel depots at Pearl Harbor, which stored millions of gallons needed to power U.S. warships and aircraft. Maintenance yards, machine shops, and submarine pens survived with limited damage. American engineers would quickly salvage and refit ships in those same dry docks that the attack had spared. In hindsight, this oversight preserved the arteries of America's Pacific Fleet. Historians emphasize that Admiral Yamamoto's decision not to launch a third strike shaped the long-term balance of the war. Japanese command weighed the risks of returning once U.S. defenses had reorganized, particularly amid uncertainty over the whereabouts of America's 3 Pacific carriers, which were not in the harbor that morning. A third wave targeting oil storage and dry docks was prepared in discussion, but rejected. Later analysts argue that had those facilities been hit, recovery might have been delayed significantly, measured in some studies as many months to a year. But because Yamamoto chose caution, Pearl Harbor burned while its logistical backbone remained usable. For survivors on Oahu, the statistics were lived through choking air and searing heat. Men dived into the water to escape decks engulfed in flames, only to surface coated in spilled oil. Rescue crews listened desperately for tapping from those trapped below, sawing through steel while fires raged overhead. In some cases, sailors were pulled out alive after hours in pitch-dark compartments. In others, the tapping went silent before rescuers could break through. Hospitals filled beyond capacity, operating tables worked without pause, and families across Hawaii struggled to account for relatives amidst chaos. In Washington, telegrams filtered in with confusion. First came word of aircraft overhead, then fuel depots struck, then ships ablaze in the harbor. By evening, the scale of disaster was clear enough to erase uncertainty. At a single stroke, the Pacific Fleet had been crippled before America had fired in defense. Roosevelt and his cabinet now faced not just damage reports, but the political certainty of war. For the American public, numbers scrolled in grim tallies. Ships lost, planes destroyed, thousands killed. It was the most devastating assault by a foreign power on U.S. territory in modern history. Yet even in tragedy, key advantages remained. The submarines moored in the harbor were unharmed, and those boats would soon begin a campaign against Japan's shipping networks. Most critically, the Pacific's 3 fleet carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were absent on December 7 and escaped untouched. In the months to come, they would become the central instruments of U.S. naval strategy. Alongside them, the survival of fuel tanks and dry docks meant that salvaged battleships could return to service after months, not years. Of the 8 damaged U.S. battleships, 6 were raised or repaired and back in operation before the war's second year closed. This combination of devastation and survival defines the paradox of Pearl Harbor. Tactically, it was among the most effective surprise strikes in modern warfare, crippling a fleet and inflicting thousands of deaths in a morning. Strategically, however, it failed to eliminate the infrastructure and carrier forces that would rebuild and project American power. Yamamoto had delivered a blow meant to shock Washington into hesitation. Instead, it accelerated America into absolute commitment, armed with resources left intact by his caution. Modern analysis brings this into sharper perspective. Industrial output figures highlight that while Japan destroyed 169 aircraft in Hawaii, American factories, by early 1942, were delivering hundreds each month. Damage to 19 vessels, grievous as it was, did not halt shipyards already scheduled for construction surges. Once fuel and repair resources were confirmed intact, U.S. Navy planners could chart recovery not in distant years, but in rapid schedules measured in months. For those who endured the raid, the day was defined by loss of comrades and destruction at close quarters. For Washington and Tokyo, its meaning stretched further into calculations of national resolve, industrial capacity, and the power of logistics. In the contrast between casualties and surviving infrastructure lay the pivot, a tactical triumph that seeded strategic failure. What emerged from Pearl Harbor was not an America permanently struck down, but an America galvanized. The dead and wounded shaped national memory, but the undamaged tanks, docks, carriers, and shipyards made recovery possible. Within 24 hours, the attack transformed American isolation into demands for action. Within weeks, planning turned to global war. The statistics of destruction provided the shock. The infrastructure spared ensured the response would be violent and swift. The assault on December 7th was both a national tragedy and a catalyst. Japan had gambled on hesitation, but ignited determination. And from that determination, the United States prepared to unleash a mobilization that would expand with speed and scale beyond anything the world had yet seen. Mobilization at unprecedented scale. What followed in the United States after December 7 was not hesitation, but mobilization on a scale few had thought possible. In 1940, American military spending accounted for roughly 2% of the national economy, a modest allocation for a nation still shaped by isolationist sentiment. Within months after Pearl Harbor, those figures climbed rapidly as Washington poured money into defense contracts, transforming a restrained peacetime economy into the engine of a global war effort. What only years earlier had been a society hesitant to commit abroad now threw its full weight behind rearmament. Factories shifted overnight. Assembly lines that had been producing cars or refrigerators were stripped down and redesigned to mass-produce tanks, trucks, and aircraft. Detroit, long the symbol of America's automotive pride, quickly became known as the arsenal of democracy, delivering armored vehicles not only for U.S. divisions, but also for Allied armies abroad. Typewriter plants shifted to producing machine gun parts, and steel mills were diverted to turn out artillery and ammunition. Contract after contract bound private industry to military needs, altering the priorities of entire communities. Across the country, civilian consumption fell away as the state diverted copper, rubber, and gasoline to the front lines. The scale of industrial output was unprecedented. Between 1939 and 1945, the United States produced roughly 192,000 aircraft, while Japan manufactured about 55,100 in the same period. That disparity captures the gulf in capacity. In tanks, trucks, and merchant shipping, similar gaps opened. Liberty ships, designed for rapid production, were launched in scores, carrying vital cargoes across oceans at rates that Axis naval power could not hope to prevent indefinitely. These were not abstract statistics. Each plane, each tank, each ship arriving to Allied theaters represented a material advantage that multiplied as the years went on. At its height, American industry dominated the fight by weight of numbers alone. Calculations comparing output in 1943 and 1944 show U.S. production in nearly every category, exceeding the combined output of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Axis leaders had built strategies around the assumption that America could not mobilize fast enough to matter before they secured their gains. By late 1942, those assumptions collapsed as convoy after convoy demonstrated how quickly America's industrial base could replace losses. But production figures were only the first step. Moving those goods into battle demanded an intricate logistical web. A bomber assembled in Seattle or a tank finished in Detroit did not matter unless it could be fueled, maintained, and deployed thousands of miles away. The United States built a transport system to match its output, coordinating rail lines, ports, and convoys in a way no other nation could. Troop ships left American harbors in steady rhythm, shielded by improved anti-submarine tactics and escorted by destroyers pressing back against German U-boats. Standardized parts meant engines built in one plant could be repaired with spares from another state, allowing movement at global scale without crippling delays. This logistical infrastructure proved decisive. It meant that US forces in North Africa, the Pacific, and Europe could all be supplied simultaneously. Where Axis powers often had to choose between reinforcing one front or another, American commanders expected uninterrupted flows of ammunition, fuel, and replacements across multiple theaters. Modern logistical analysis shows that this continuity of supply was as important as the tanks and planes themselves, sustaining pressure that enemies could not match. The mobilization reshaped American society from the inside out. 16 million citizens would eventually serve in the armed forces, but the labor of those at home was equally critical. Women entered war industries in vast numbers, welding ship hulls, inspecting aircraft, and maintaining the pace of round-the-clock production. Migration patterns changed as workers moved toward new shipyards and aircraft plants, building entire communities around factories that had never existed before the war. Plants never fell silent, illuminated through the night by shift work that kept machinery running without interruption. These changes permanently altered the American workforce and expanded roles that had previously been closed to many. Economic effects were dramatic. The depression of the previous decade gave way to full employment as federal spending guaranteed steady wages. Industrial regions once hit hardest by unemployment saw their output double or triple by the middle of the war. Families accepted rationing and shortages as the price of national survival. Housing in boomtowns often fell behind demand, but workers stayed because wages and job security were unmatched by earlier standards. For many communities, the war years marked the beginning of long-term prosperity, even as sacrifices in daily life remained constant. Japan had gambled that America's response to Pearl Harbor would be slow and uncertain, and that growing across Asia would offer the empire time to consolidate. The speed of US mobilization proved those calculations dangerously false. Within weeks of the attack, Washington poured billions into contracts, ordered mass expansions of airplane and ship construction, and rushed new draft calls through Congress. Production schedules measured in years were rewritten in months. The shock of Pearl Harbor ignited not paralysis, but acceleration on every front. What Japan had underestimated was the sheer capacity of the American economy once directed. By mid-war, aircraft output alone dwarfed that of the Axis, and steel allocations tilted heavily toward war needs. Japan could not compete with that scale even if it abandoned every remaining civilian industry. Tokyo's strategic clock, measured in reserves of oil and supplies, ticked down far faster than projected as American firepower closed the gap. The key lesson from this transformation was that victory depended on systems, not just individual machines. Coordinated convoys, standardized production, and global supply chains stitched the war together into one effort. The United States proved capable of sustaining multiple campaigns across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific without exhausting its base. For Japan and Germany, strategies that aimed at exhausting the United States instead revealed how overmatched they were from the start. By 1944, the advantage was overwhelming. Total aircraft production had passed the 100,000 mark. Hundreds of new Liberty ships patrolled supply lines. Tanks and trucks filled ports awaiting shipment in volumes that no blockade could erase. Each statistic represented not just material superiority, but the collapse of any Axis hope of long-term victory. The strike at Pearl Harbor, meant to hold America back, had instead forced a mobilization so vast that it erased the very calculations that had inspired Japan's gamble. The attack that aimed to cripple American capacity had instead unleashed the opposite. Outproducing its enemies by margins approaching 4-1, the United States carried its arsenal across oceans, feeding multiple battlefronts at once. Pearl Harbor became not a deterrent, but the trigger for industrial acceleration on a global scale, one that gave the Allies the means to absorb losses and continue fighting without pause. Yet even as American factories roared and convoys departed, the war itself was expanding outward. While the United States mobilized at home, Japanese divisions pressed new offensives across Asia and the Pacific. The strike on Hawaii was never intended as an isolated blow. It was part of a wider plan that unfolded immediately after, extending the conflict across half the globe. The Pacific War expands. The morning after Pearl Harbor brought no pause. Even as fires still smoldered across Oahu, Japan pressed forward with a coordinated campaign that had been set in motion long before December 7. Within hours, Japanese armies and fleets struck in several directions at once, launching assaults on British Malaya, invading the Philippines, besieging Hong Kong, and driving into the Dutch East Indies. These were not improvisations, but parts of an offensive schedule drawn up to secure resources and cripple Allied power across Asia. Hawaii was only one opening blow in a far larger plan. In Malaya, the Japanese advance exposed how deeply the Allies had underestimated their enemy. British defenses depended on the assumption that dense jungles, swamps, and broken terrain would stall or funnel attackers into predictable routes. Instead, Japanese units moved at a pace that astonished defenders. Columns of soldiers mounted on simple bicycles streamed through the countryside, moving silently and with startling speed. Lightweight and easy to carry across obstacles, the bicycles required no fuel and allowed entire divisions to cover ground faster than motorized convoys. Roadblocks that officers believed would delay attackers for days were outflanked in hours. Within weeks, Japanese forces closed on Singapore, the most important British fortress east of the Suez Canal. Singapore's fall remains one of the most significant Allied defeats of the early war. Known as the Gibraltar of the East, it was built to withstand a naval assault from the south. Guns and bunkers faced the sea, guarding the harbor with massive firepower. But the attack came from the landward side, where defenders had few heavy weapons. By February 1942, encircled troops had little choice but to surrender. In total, nearly 80,000 soldiers, British, Indian, and Australian, laid down their arms. The scale of the capitulation sent shock through Britain and its empire. To Asian communities long under colonial rule, the victory carried symbolic weight. Japan's triumph made it clear that Western powers once thought invincible could be defeated in mere weeks. In the Philippines, another intense struggle unfolded. Japanese landings began in December 1941, and relentless assaults quickly pushed American and Filipino forces into retreat. By January, defenders had been driven back to the Bataan Peninsula, where over 70,000 men resisted for months under deteriorating conditions. Cut off from supply, they endured bombardments, dwindling rations, and outbreaks of disease. General Douglas MacArthur, ordered by Washington to evacuate, left the islands with his now famous pledge to return. Those who remained fought until April 1942, when the starving garrison at Bataan finally collapsed. A few weeks later, the island fortress of Corregidor fell as well, marking the end of organized resistance in the Philippines. It was after Bataan's surrender that one of the Pacific War's darkest chapters took place. More than 70,000 American and Filipino prisoners were forced to march over 60 miles to prison camps under broiling heat with little food or water. The ordeal became known as the Bataan Death March. Survivors described guards who beat stragglers and executed those too weak to continue. Contemporary estimates record that roughly 1,100 Americans and about 5,000 Filipinos were killed outright or died of exhaustion and disease along the route. Recent archival and medical studies suggest the overall toll may have been higher than early tallies, though exact figures remain debated. Tens of thousands endured unthinkable suffering, leaving the march etched in memory as a measure of both cruelty and neglect. Meanwhile, in the Dutch East Indies, Japanese armies and naval units targeted some of the most valuable resources in Asia. The islands contained rich oil fields, fuel reserves critical to prolonging Japan's war effort. From late December through the spring of 1942, Japanese amphibious assaults seized territory across Sumatra, Java, and Borneo. Allied attempts to resist, including a combined Dutch, British, American, and Australian fleet, suffered severe losses. Within 3 months, the archipelago was under Japanese control. Engineers were dispatched immediately to restore oil production, and Tokyo celebrated the victories as proof that the empire had achieved self-sufficiency. For a time, the expansion looked unstoppable. Between December 1941 and March 1942, Japanese victories toppled fortress after fortress. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day 1941. Singapore followed in February. The Philippines collapsed by May. Across Asia and the Pacific, Western colonial authority disintegrated in the face of swift attacks. Newspapers across the region documented retreats and captures, while Japanese propaganda filled cities with images of defeated Allied soldiers. The narrative presented to Asia was simple. Western empires that had ruled for centuries were now crumbling in weeks at the hands of a new power. Yet behind these victories lay growing vulnerabilities. Each conquest added thousands of miles of ocean to supply and defend. Garrisons scattered across conquered territory required food, weapons, and constant reinforcement, all of which had to travel by sea. Japan possessed only a limited merchant fleet, and every vessel pressed into service to haul resources reduced the tonnage available to supply forward bases. Historians reviewing Japanese records emphasize that shipping capacity by mid-1942 was already overstretched. The empire had expanded faster than it could sustain, and the strain on logistics only deepened as the months passed. The overextension was not immediately obvious. In early 1942, Allied resistance remained fragmented and uncoordinated. Japanese speed and surprise gave the impression that the empire could advance without limit. But logistical data collected later demonstrates how thinly spread the Japanese effort had become. Captured colonies provided oil, rice, and rubber, but moving them home diverted ships needed to feed soldiers on the front lines. Troop convoys and resource shipments competed for scarce tonnage. As more territory fell under Japanese control, the empire paradoxically lost flexibility. By the middle of 1942, this structural weakness became an opening the Allies would exploit, particularly through submarine campaigns that targeted merchant shipping. Still, in the short term, Japan had reshaped the balance of power in Asia. With Singapore lost, Britain's imperial prestige in the region had been shattered. With the Philippines occupied, the United States no longer had a forward operating base west of the Pacific. With the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies under occupation, Tokyo appeared to have solved its most desperate wartime shortages. For observers at the time, the sheer extent of conquest looked like a decisive victory. Modern assessments recast this moment as the peak of Japan's fortunes. The rapid series of offensives across Malaya, the Philippines, and the East Indies were impressive in timing and scale, but they created the very conditions that would undermine Japan's chances for a long war. Supply bottlenecks, exposed shipping routes, and the demands of occupation turned early triumphs into liabilities. What Japan had gained in territory, it lacked the ability to sustain. The offensive campaigns of late 1941 and early 1942 thus reshaped much of Asia in a matter of months. But in parallel, another story was unfolding. Even as Japanese armies raced across colonial territories, reports from the weeks preceding December 7 reveal how many warning signals had already circulated among the Allies. In hindsight, Understanding those overlooked clues has become central to explaining how Japan achieved its early shock at all. Intelligence failures and missed signals. In the lead-up to December 7, a web of signals, reports and hints crossed Allied desks, but none were transformed into a decisive order for heightened readiness. The record shows not an absence of warning, but rather a failure of integration. Allied monitoring posts intercepted Japanese fleet traffic shifting eastward during November 1941. British codebreakers separately flagged deployments pushing beyond home waters. Consular offices in Asia described unusual ship movements that raised concern. Yet each fragment remained isolated, treated as one more entry in a sea of routine reports. Without a centralized structure to bind them together, the picture that now seems clear remains stubbornly fragmented. Inside Washington, the Army and Navy followed parallel tracks. Attachés in Asia reported increased Japanese buildup, while naval listening posts tracked bursts of radio chatter suggesting carrier task forces at sea. A merged view might have irritated senior leaders into action. Instead, bureaucratic boundaries assured that each service filed and debated its own data separately, rarely escalating analysis beyond internal channels. Memoranda surfaced in November, debated in December, and circulated cautiously between desks. Warnings were acknowledged, but their urgency faded as they passed through institutional filters never designed to unify assessment across services. The consequence was a signal-to-noise problem made worse by sheer volume. Late in 1941, the intelligence community was drowning in material. Every day brought cables from embassies, surveillance logs from Pacific outposts, and rumors relayed from commercial shipping. None of these came with a simple marker, flagging them as critical to immediate action. In the flood of paperwork, urgent notes about fleet maneuvers sat beside minor details about regional trade. The very flood of information dulled the sense of imminent threat. What might have stood out in isolation became buried under routine. Interpretation fragmented as well. Some intelligence analysts leaned toward anticipating strikes against British outposts in Southeast Asia. Others speculated that the Philippines were the most likely target. A different group emphasized maritime activity near the Dutch East Indies. Each assessment held fragments of truth, but faced with multiple plausible scenarios, cautious leaders chose not to commit to one. To call alarms for every possibility risked credibility loss if nothing happened quickly. The demand for certainty, impossible by nature in such circumstances, paralyzed meaningful action. The situation in Hawaii itself compounds the paradox. Commanders received cautionary alerts from Washington stressing the risk of Japanese aggression, but always framed in general terms. None identified Pearl Harbor as an imminent target. Officers treated them as reminders to be vigilant against sabotage or minor provocations, not as signals to expect aerial assault. Even new radar, installed just months earlier, reflected this gap in posture. Operators trained only intermittently, and stations were unstaffed for continuous watch. On the morning of the attack, however, radar did function as designed. At 7:02 a.m., operators at Oahu tracked a large formation of inbound aircraft. They called it in, but the duty officer dismissed the warning as expected B-17 bombers arriving from the mainland. Procedure did not permit immediate redirection of aircraft or activation of base-wide alerts. Minutes later, Japanese dive bombers appeared over the island. The technology had worked, yet the system for recognizing and acting on its output had not. Another warning came just before the first bomb struck. At 6:45 a.m., the destroyer USS Ward engaged and sank a Japanese midget submarine outside Pearl Harbor's entrance. Sailors dropped depth charges and radioed their report to higher command, yet the message was delayed in processing and never reached a level able to sound full alarms. Radar detection and submarine engagement had each offered an advance signal. Both were recorded, but neither converted into effective readiness. Outside Hawaii, other signals carried similar urgency, but failed to trigger action in time. Among them were coded instructions sent from Tokyo to Japanese embassies overseas. Washington had broken some Japanese diplomatic systems, and in early December, cryptographers intercepted dispatches ordering diplomats to destroy code materials and prepare for abrupt withdrawal. Analysts reviewing these messages later judged them as indicators war was imminent. But at the time, interpretation erred toward believing they reflected breakdown in diplomatic relations, not the launching of a military strike. Decoding lag, strict secrecy, and the difficulty of sharing classified intelligence across services meant that Hawaii never saw their implication until after the attack. The roots of this failure were structural, not personal. Investigations after the disaster confirmed that no single office possessed a complete picture. Army and Navy intelligence functioned as parallel organisms with separate distribution lists, separate encryption clearances, and separate chains of analysis. Where one office saw fragments of code destruction orders, another tracked fleet radio silence, and still another catalogued troop movements. None had authority or mechanisms to merge these signals into one integrated alarm. In that absence, action defaulted to routine. For decades afterward, Pearl Harbor would be cited as a textbook example not of intelligence absence, but of intelligence overload without synthesis. Thousands of data points passed through desks, but without institutional structures to merge them, the crucial patterns slipped through. Later studies emphasize how the culture of caution became its own barrier. Officers reluctant to act without certainty, branches hesitant to amplify alarms that could embarrass their credibility, and commanders more prepared for sabotage on the ground than for squadrons overhead. The tragedy is heightened by hindsight. When later analysts lined up the declassified records, patterns jumped into view. Embassy code destruction orders issued just days before, the Ward submarine report only hours before, radar blips detected less than 40 minutes before. Each element carried its own note of danger. Together, they formed a chorus that, had it been heard as one, might have elevated preparedness. In practice, they remained dispersed, muted by procedure and bureaucratic separation. These lessons reshaped intelligence practice in the United States. The very notion that Army and Navy could operate independent channels without coordination collapsed after Pearl Harbor. The failure forced reforms, leading ultimately to structures designed to integrate military intelligence, signals intercepts, and diplomatic reporting under unified command. Historians note that the drive towards centralized intelligence in the post-war era drew directly from recognition of how costly siloed systems had proven in 1941. For those living through the attack, it felt like sudden lightning without warning. For history, the record shows it differently. Indicators abounded, but the inability to unify them left Hawaii exposed. The lesson was not that no one saw danger, but that too many eyes saw it without ever speaking in unison. The consequences of that morning reached beyond sunken battleships and lost lives. In one stroke, the flaws of intelligence coordination and the dangers of fragmentation were laid bare. Yet what happened next revealed how quickly America could transform when forced to act without doubt. From isolation to global superpower. December 8, 1941. Less than one day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Congress gathered to decide whether to declare war on Japan. Weeks earlier, the chambers had echoed with cautious debates about neutrality. Now, the wreckage in Hawaii framed their choice in stark terms. The vote in the Senate was unanimous, 82-0. In the House of Representatives, 388 members voted in favor, with only one dissenting voice, Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin of Montana, who had also opposed entry into the First World War. These numbers, precise and overwhelming, capture the scale of political transformation. Decades of division collapsed in a single roll call, replaced by a unified mandate for war. The decision in Congress was mirrored on the streets. Until that week, isolationism had dominated American politics, supported by public polls that consistently resisted sending troops overseas. Pearl Harbor broke that alignment in hours. War was no longer theoretical. It was not framed in policy discussions or abstract entanglements, but visible in smoke, casualties, and the paralysis of a fleet. Enlistment stations filled within days, crowded by men determined to volunteer before the draft could claim them. Newspapers ran casualty reports beside maps of the Pacific, while factory announcements shifted overnight to new production contracts. America's posture of distance was gone. The mobilization that followed was extraordinary in scale and speed. By the war's end in 1945, about 16 million Americans had served in uniform. This meant that within 4 years, more than 10% of the national population had been absorbed into military service. Families in every community sent sons to Europe or the Pacific. Army platoons drawn from the Midwest fought in France, naval squadrons from the West Coast struck the Philippines, and air crews trained in Texas and Florida carried bombs over Japan. No town or city remained untouched. Service stretched across generations and regions, binding the nation in shared sacrifice. Economic mobilization followed the same trajectory. At the start of 1941, military expenditures claimed only a small share of government spending, roughly 2% of national output. By 1942, those limits had vanished. Congress authorized vast appropriations, and industry was redirected toward weapons, vehicles, and supply. American gross domestic product doubled between 1939 and 1945. Steel mills and assembly lines ran around the clock, while agricultural production expanded to feed both civilians and armies abroad. The mobilization not only supported the fight, but created an infrastructure of industry and research that remained influential long after the war. Unlike most combatants, the United States closed the conflict economically stronger than before it entered. The material transformation carried into political life. During the First World War, America had stepped back from international leadership after victory. Pearl Harbor altered that trajectory. By 1944 and 1945, American officials stood at the center of plans for the post-war order. Half the world's industrial capacity and the strongest navy on Earth granted unmatched influence. Washington guided the creation of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods financial agreements, and alliances that set terms for an emerging global order. What had begun as isolation ended as dominance, a shift visible in both institutions and treaties. Historians studying long-term trends point directly to Pearl Harbor as the rupture that made this possible. Economic analyses trace the surge of production and national wealth back to the demands of full mobilization. Political studies underline how the near-unanimous votes in Congress created consensus, unlike anything in recent American history. Public opinion moved in tandem. Before December 1941, surveys showed overwhelming resistance to dispatching troops abroad. Afterward, those numbers reversed almost completely. Where once caution dominated, now advocacy for total war prevailed. The cultural impact was equally significant. Wartime propaganda framed the conflict as a shared national duty, blending tragedy with purpose. Posters encouraged the purchase of war bonds and conserving resources. Films and radio broadcasts portrayed the frontline as connected to the factory floor. The singular descent of Jeanette Rankin became a symbol of how complete the reversal was. Her solitary no vote in the House captured the distance between pro-war caution and the new consensus that Pearl Harbor had forged. What emerged from these shifts was not temporary alignment, but structural redefinition. As the war ended, America possessed a permanent, standing military, overseas bases, and economic links that spanned oceans. Pro-war isolationism could not coexist with global commitments that now touched Europe, Asia, and beyond. By the late 1940s, the United States directed rebuilding efforts in Germany and Japan, underwrote international currency stability, and organized alliances to contain future threats. The superpower role was no longer optional. It had been cemented by the transformations that followed December 7, 1941. This sequence explains why the attack on Pearl Harbor occupies such a central place in American memory. It was not only an event of loss and destruction, though those were real and devastating. It was the moment when domestic political resistance to global engagement collapsed and a mobilization of unparalleled size began. The casualty lists of December 7, the millions who enlisted after, the factories retooled, and the GDP doubled, all stand as markers of a nation shifted toward leadership on a truly global scale. Japan had sought to deter American intervention by destroying its Pacific Fleet, hoping that destruction would buy time for expansion. Instead, the attack achieved the opposite. It prompted unity across political institutions, rapid mobilization of industry and manpower, and an enduring global posture that few had imagined possible at the start of that decade. When historians trace the rise of the so-called American century, they identify this change not in 1939 or even 1940, but in the hours and days following Pearl Harbor. The transformation carried costs measured in blood and sacrifice, but it also delivered power of a kind that no Axis plan had accounted for. Far from delaying America, the strike accelerated it. By the war's close, the United States was more than a participant. It had become the decisive force in shaping outcomes across Europe and Asia, setting frameworks that endured for generations. The scale of this change highlights Pearl Harbor's significance as more than a military disaster. It redrew the boundaries of American identity and locked the nation into a role from which it has not withdrawn. What had once been a republic wary of overseas wars emerged as the anchor of international order. It was a transformation powered by statistics, millions in uniform, factories producing beyond precedent, and political unity embodied in near-unanimous votes. The meaning of Pearl Harbor, then, cannot be reduced to the ships destroyed or the lives lost. Its legacy is measured in what it set into motion: the rise of economic dominance, political consensus, and global leadership. Those outcomes define the trajectory not just of the war, but of the century that followed. They illustrate how sudden crisis can accelerate national evolution with lasting impact. That legacy leads naturally to the broader conclusion. The attack mattered less for the devastation it caused than for the transformation it forced upon the United States. In considering Pearl Harbor's legacy, what stands out is the scale of both loss and consequence. The attack killed 2,403 Americans and left 1,178 wounded in less than 2 hours, a tactical blow of extraordinary violence. Yet the longer arc was shaped not by destruction, but by capacity. While Japan produced around 55,000 aircraft over the course of the war, the United States would build nearly 192,000. The strike that began as a Japanese success thus ended as a strategic miscalculation. Pearl Harbor proved that surprise could secure a moment, but only sustained mobilization decides wars.